So let's shift it to Cameron. So for the United States, maybe I'm gonna shift the camera there, and we can give you more.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I trust your journey was shorter than mine, coming from the United States, and given the craziness of the world these days, one never knows where you're going to end up when you fly. I took Air Serbia recently, and my destination was Split, and I ended up in Vienna, Austria, stuck for the night. So this is the nature of the world that we live in, but it is an adventure every time I'm in Europe, so I feel blessed for that. I did want to say, before I give my remarks, the great essayist, polemicist, writer Christopher Hitchens said, "Don't take refuge in the false security of consensus." And both Mikhail and Clara are at the front lines of that. They are practitioners, they're on the ground, and they have been challenging moral proclamations devoid of logistical considerations, devoid of political representation for people in Poland, for Czechs in Czechia, for Germans, and countless other European peoples and Americans who at this time don't appear to have their voices heard in the halls of Brussels or in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere. And it is the work that they're doing that is indispensable to reconnecting that representative body with the will of the population, which I would say is broken all over the Western world. And this is really the theme that I'm going to address in my remarks. So thank you for the work that you've done. And Mikhail, thank you for inviting me to Poland and,
Always welcome.
And to Warsaw. And let's be blessed that we have sun out today. I like good weather. The topic of my talk is going to be nation or immigrants, pluralism against democracy. I am, as I said, not a practitioner. I'm not a policy maker. I'm a private citizen. I'm a businessman. I'm also a social media personality. I have a YouTube channel. I participate on a podcast. And I say that to say this. As such, I have the opportunity to interact with people from all over the world, not just in the United States. And over the last 10 years or so, I have been traveling cross-continent. I've lived in every continent on the face of the earth, excluding a couple, from Asia to South America, across Europe, obviously North America. I've been to cities like Vancouver. I lived in Buenos Aires in Argentina. I lived in Colombia. And what I have observed, and I'm sure it's no surprise to people in this room or in this space, what I have observed is there is a kind of stress on nations around the world. So, for example, in South America, there is a crisis because of Venezuelan refugees, and Venezuelan refugees are proliferating across South America, in countries like Colombia, but as far south as Uruguay or Argentina. Now, this obviously causes problems because you have logistical, infrastructure, economic, social welfare problems. You have cultural differences that sprout from time to time. And you also observe when you go to a place like Colombia, where refugees can actually assimilate and be sort of rehabilitated or cared for in ways that are better, in part because the culture is very close. The language is the same, or their borderlands, right? In addition to seeing the refugee crisis in South America involving Venezuelans, and there are others as well, the first time I came to Poland was in 2022. And I flew into Prague in Czechia. I took trips to Berlin, Germany. I was in other parts of Central Europe. And of course, in the fall of 2022, this is right on the heels of the Russian invasion and special military operation. And so there were Ukrainians everywhere. Ukrainians in coffee shops, Ukrainians living in various parts of Central Europe, but especially in Warsaw. And at the time, I was told there were maybe a few 100,000. Some said closer to 800,000 to 1 million. Of course, the population of Warsaw itself is in the millions. So this is a big number. This is a very big number. And while there may be some cultural affinities and similarities, it's very difficult for countries like Poland that may not be as wealthy as others in Europe to actually accommodate such a thing. But that all raises questions. Why is it that there is this deluge of refugees around the world? What is the nature of the machinery of nonprofits and non-governmental organizations, and this notion of pluralism? Pluralism, I would say, it gets at the heart of what I want to talk about today. It has been said that history is a fable told about the dead. I think that there is much truth in that. Maybe less sinister truth, more so that history is complex, that it's often indigestible. And in order to understand it, particularly for future generations, there needs to be simplification. Unfortunately, simplification often leads to oversimplification. And I think so much of our political discourse is born in the aftermath of the Second War. Certainly it is for the United States. And the oversimplification of that war basically was that nationalism, as we understood it before the World Wars, is an evil thing. It's a dangerous thing. It's a sinister thing, particularly for Western peoples, whether they're Americans or Germans or Canadians or what have you. And the solution, the antidote, the counter narrative that emerged in the aftermath of those wars was this idea of pluralism. And pluralism is often synonymous with democracy, depending on who you speak with. Whether you're talking to people in Brussels or you're in the United States and you're talking about refugee advocacy groups, pluralism is part of the fabric of democracy, except that pluralism is basically the idea that there are multicultural, there are multi-religious groups, there are various component parts of democracy. And this idea has become so strong, has become so embedded in the architecture of governments, in the United Nations, in the European Union, certainly in the United States, that the machinery that Clara talked about to some degree has become more powerful than the democratic mechanisms that exist in the nation states themselves. The democratic machinery that's supposed to represent the people and the land and the country that's actually housing a lot of these peoples. So you have this sort of tension between pluralism and democracy. This did not start overnight. And what I'd like to do is add a little bit of context for what's going on in the United States, because I think so much of what's happening in Europe is following in the footsteps of what's been done in the United States. If you go back to the 1950s, there was a senator from New York named Jacob Javits. Jacob Javits penned an editorial, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, maybe it was in the New York Times, arguing that the United States should open the floodgates. And what he meant at the time was that the United States is a wealthy country, and we were in a prolonged, protracted battle against communism. And that one of the mechanisms by which we could fight communism was we could take in people from various parts of the world into the United States. We could open the floodgates to non-American immigration. And so to say, we could afford to do this, not just because we're a wealthy country, but also because this is part of our democratic mission. And ultimately, the United States was really not a nation of its peoples as much as it was a nation of ideas. And this ultimately produced a legislation in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, that was a tidal wave of change for Americans, because it had changed immigration law in such a way that had broken precedent for the first couple hundred years of our history. This then led to a sequence, a cascade of further legislation that did effectively the same thing. In 1986, Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, signed an amnesty, and this amnesty was designed to close the borders with Mexico, to legalize the illegal immigrants that were in the country, that we were not disposed to remigrate, if you will, or to expel. And this amnesty, like the Act of 1965, was designed to be controlled, to be contained, to not break a certain regulatory governance, if you will. And of course, the opposite happened. The floodgates were in fact opened, and this led to, from 1965 until 2025, according to the Pew Research Center, some 75 plus million people migrating into the United States. 75 million. To give some context, that's almost equivalent to adding 2 Polands into the United States alone in that time period, 1965, 2025. During the Biden presidency alone, a presidency that advocated for refugee rights, that talked about the necessity for providing care and accommodation and standards, a higher standard of living, maybe redistribution for a refugee crisis at the southern border in the United States. The estimates are that some 15 million people came from 2020 when President Biden was elected to 2024 when he left. In this time frame, as the millions upon millions came, this idea of pluralism really flowered, and it became the consensus. It became the popular concept or construct for how the United States should envision itself as a nation of immigrants. Not a nation of peoples, not a nation per se with a defined or specific identity, language, culture, religion, rule of law, but a nation of immigrants, a nation that was the receptacle of peoples all over the world. You're tired, you're hungry, you're desperate, you're poor, etc., etc. Very little concern or care from the elected government was given to how that might actually be handled logistically, to whether or not the population of the United States wanted it. And incidentally, from 1965 until 2025, according to polling data that's fairly reliable and accurate, the consensus among the electorate, even those that were on the left, you might say, so Democratic voters, was that there was too much immigration in the United States, was that we were not protecting our borders, that our national identity was impaired or potentially vulnerable, that something must be done about this. And despite that consensus emerging in the population, little to nothing was done about this issue, more or less until 2016, when a certain President Donald Trump was elected. Now, his popular mandate was exactly this. It was to deal with not just illegal immigration, but the notion that the United States identity was divorced from its past completely, that we were some sort of fungible collection of immigrants, and that we were now a pluralistic society. This has sowed the seeds of incredible division in the country, social economic inequality, a sense of insecurity, and divisiveness along virtually every fault line that one can imagine: language, religion, culture, and obviously politics. In 2024, this came to a head with the election of Donald Trump for the second time. And in Donald Trump's second election, he gave an inaugural address and said the following: "The entire nation is rapidly unifying behind our agenda, with dramatic increases in support from virtually every element of our society. Young and old, men and women, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, urban, suburban, rural, and very importantly, we had a powerful win in all 7 swing states, and the popular vote, we won by millions of people." This in a speech he gave in January of this year. Shortly thereafter began various reforms involving federal agencies like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, which then began to try and reverse the tens of millions, by some estimates, of illegal immigrants that are in the United States. And bear in mind that according to U.S. law, if you're born in the United States, that you have citizenship bestowed upon you, and therefore you have all the rights that American citizens have. But was there a shift in consensus in favor of the Trump agenda, which seemed to validate his decisive electoral win? Well, no, there has not been. And in fact, there has been quite the opposite. So the minority leader of the House, a man named Hakeem Jeffries, has argued and vociferously that in his position as the minority leader and his party's leader and the various constituencies and municipalities across the country, that they will do whatever they can, according to the law, to fight this effort to restore order to our southern border, but also to get control of our immigration problem, which, as I said, is in the tens of millions of people. And so this has precipitated a series of legal actions against what the Trump administration is trying to do, as well as to create what are called ICE-free zones or sanctuary cities, things of this nature, passed by mayors of cities like Chicago or Portland, or in some cases, whole governors or governors of whole states like California. In this case, I would reference Gavin Newsom. And so we have very definitely the makings of a conflict on our hand. And this conflict is such that much of the spirit of the law is now against the letter of the law, because the letter of the law supports this new groundswell of immigrant population that lives in the United States, that has acquired a critical mass and therefore political representation, democratic representation, you might argue, democratic representation that legitimates, you might argue, that validates the negligence, the violation of the law, the violation of federal law, the violation of immigrant law that dates back to 1965, in which the floodgates were open. So this sort of conflict, this tension, is now beginning to play out on the streets in major cities across the United States, in Los Angeles, and Chicago, and Portland, and Washington, D.C. And of course, tethered to this has been an explosion of criminality in the United States, a drug crisis, an economic crisis, an infrastructure crisis. And as we begin to sort of try and disentangle ourselves from this mess, the same thing seems to be happening across Western Europe. So a couple numbers that are equally striking in a much smaller country in the United Kingdom, obviously not part of the European Union, but part of the sort of European fabric. Since 1997, or rather from 1997 to 2010, about 6 million immigrants were taken in the United Kingdom. Bear in mind, I think there's 60 million in the UK. From 2010 to 2022, there were about 4 million. All under a conservative government, mind you. From 2022 to 2023, that number swelled in a single year to the millions. So 2.4 million came into the country in 2022, and I believe in 2023 as well. So this crisis has accumulated. The same thing has happened in France. The same thing has happened in Germany, as Clara mentioned, from 2015 forward. These numbers have swelled. And as I said, in the United States, they've acquired political power and democratic representation. The same thing has happened in Europe. So how do we square this circle? What is the future? This is the conundrum that we face today. There's a very famous court case that was argued in 1997, a court case about the right of the federal government in the United States to requisition, to commandeer local non-federal assets to enforce federal law. In this case, it was a law called the Brady Law, and the Brady Law was designed to conduct background checks on people acquiring handguns. This was a law designed to curtail gun violence in the United States. Well, some local law enforcement officers in states like Montana and Arizona sued the federal government in that case, charging that it was illegal for them to use their services to collect background checks on people that were applying for handguns. And in fact, they won that case. And a conservative judge who gave the opinion on that matter, again, the tension between federal law and local municipal law at the state level in the United States, a guy named Justice Antonin Scalia overruled the federal law, saying basically the following: that any judgment must demand three considerations. Any federal law. The first is the historical understanding and practice of the United States, the structure of the Constitution, which is the governing body of the United States, and the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court. Now, on that basis, you have three sources of precedent. The problem today is that we have at least 50 million, probably a lot more, people that are in uncertain status. Maybe they are legal citizens according to the letter of the law, but as part of a broader illegal tidal wave of people that have come into the country against the will of the population, which never voted for this and has only voted against it. The question is, who's right? Is it the letter of the law or is it the spirit of the law? And do these precedents have authority on this matter? I would submit that they do not. And so what is happening is that the United States and the federal government, in this case, the Trump administration, is trying to take extra constitutional powers to deal with this situation. And I suspect that this is the template that is going to be followed in countries like Germany and France and the United Kingdom, where they are facing an emergency crisis that necessitates this kind of power concentrated in the government to deal with it. Again, some kind of a reconstitution of state, a reintegration, if you will, of the nation, of the people with the government, which has been subverted and sort of repurposed towards these new refugee populations, immigrant populations, which are operating the machinery of government against the electorate that never voted for them to be there in the first place. This is the nature of the crisis that we face. I suspect that that will require the emergence of a new political authority, maybe a post-EU authority. I don't know. This is the direction where we are headed. Thank you for your attention to this issue, and let's see how it works out.